Hello, everyone. Welcome to Sound Faith 2025. My name is Tyson James. I'm the president of Sound Faith Consulting, and it's truly an honor to be able to bring this event to you tonight. Thank you, first of all, to everyone in attendance tonight. Thank you for braving downtown Boston and all of its obstacles. It's like a ninja warrior course trying to get over here, but thank you for coming. Thank you also to Tremont Baptist Church for hosting this fantastic event. Can we just give them a round of applause for this? Gorgeous. Thank you especially to Dr. Bart Ehrman and Dr. Mike Licona for agreeing to do this debate. I was actually very worried that they were so tired of each other from having debated so many times before that they'd be like, no, absolutely no way. But then I remembered I have younger brothers and we never got tired of fighting. So I'm so happy that they agreed to do this. So thank you guys. Also, thank you to my brother Nate Sala over here. He's the founder of Wise Disciple Ministry. He has agreed to be the moderator of tonight's debate. He is a former debate coach and teacher, and he's done a lot of debate teacher reacts videos on his YouTube channel, Wise Disciple, so please check those out. I'm very grateful tonight for his experience in moderating tonight's debate. I do also want to encourage you, before you leave, to check out the sales tables back there, especially the one with all the books on it. I drove those books here personally from Las Vegas, and I don't want to take them back, so please load up with all the books that you can. All of the books are cheaper than you'll find on Amazon, so please take advantage of that. With that, enjoy your event, and I will bring Nate Sala up to introduce our debaters.
Wow, I want to take it all in. This is a really great venue, great space. Good evening. Thanks for coming out to this wonderful Boston evening and to join the festivities. As we begin this event, I want you to get settled and I want you to get comfortable, but also I want you to lean in with your minds. Tonight's topic is who wrote the Gospels? And to help us explore this particular topic, we have two opponents, two debaters, who are uniquely qualified to engage this particular topic with their specific expertise and their backgrounds. I'm going to introduce him. Dr. Mike Licona is a professor of New Testament studies at Houston Christian University. He's the president of Risen Jesus, Inc. It's risenjesus.com. He has his PhD in New Testament studies with distinction from University of Pretoria. Mike has participated in several high-profile debates with the likes of Shabir Ali, Richard Carrier, Matt Dillahunty, Dan Barker, and John Dominic Crossan, and he lived to tell the tale. Nobody? Okay. And he's debated Dr. Ehrman as well. Let's welcome to the stage Dr. Mike Licona. Dr. Bart Ehrman is the James A. Gray Distinguished Professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He has his PhD from Princeton Seminary. He's an expert on the New Testament and the history of early Christianity. He's written or edited 30 books, numerous scholarly articles, and dozens of book reviews. 6 of his books have been on the New York Times bestseller list. And his website is bartehrman.com. Would you help me in welcoming Dr. Bart Ehrman? Listen, friends, I'm not going to drone on and on because I hate when moderators do that. Listen, debate is all about clash. The clash of ideas. That's why tonight's discussion is so important, that you are able to be here and to wrestle with the best presentations on both sides of this particular topic tonight. It's important. This is meaningful dialogue. It's why tonight's conversation matters. Here's how the format is going to go. We have opening statements. So that's 20 minutes each for Drs. Licona and Ehrman. Then we're going to go into first rebuttals, and that's 10 minutes each. We're going to get into cross-examination. That's 10 minutes each. And then we'll go into second rebuttals, which is 5 minutes each. We'll get into closing statements, which is 5 minutes each. And then finally, audience Q&As. If you notice, there's some microphones here on the sides, and we'll get into that, where I'll moderate that for about a half an hour. All right, that's enough out of me. Without further ado, let's get started. Dr. Licona, the floor is yours. You have 20 minutes.
evening, everyone. Imagine that you walked into a specialty bookstore that sells old books obtained from estate sales. One book grabs your attention, so you buy it, take it home, and place it on a shelf for display. A few months later, you have a friend over who comments on the book. She removes it from your shelf and begins thumbing through it until she arrives at an old brittle note nestled between some pages you hadn't noticed. She hands you the book and you carefully remove the note and lay it on the table where you both read it curiously. I write this so the burden dies with me. In 1908, beneath the glow of an unnamed Washington hotel lamp, I met Teddy Roosevelt. He spoke of fatigue from battles he fought in Cuba and in Washington. I spoke of the loneliness of clever women. 4 times that winter we crossed the line his ring drew. Each meeting was arranged through notes routed by a mutual friend who will never be named. Teddy was gentle, charming, grateful, and tore himself with guilt afterward. I loved him for that. I loved him for 3 hours at a time. History will say he was faithful. Let it. I know otherwise. You look at one another in shock, not having the words to say. TR is known to have had a strong moral compass and was faithful to his wife. So this is big. Maybe. Who wrote it? No signature, no date, no context. Was it a diary entry by the mistress? Or was it nothing more than an exercise for a writing class attended long ago? You would never know. That story is my invention. The graphic is AI, so don't believe it. When we come to the Gospels, many think they possess some of the same qualities as the note in my story. No signature, no title, no date. In fact, my friend Bart says this about the traditional authors of the Gospels. The reality is that these persons were almost certainly not the authors of these Gospels. The Gospels are not memories recorded by those who were eyewitnesses. They are memories of later authors who had heard about Jesus from others, who were telling what they had heard from others, who were telling what they had heard from yet others. These stories had been in circulation for years and decades before they themselves heard them. In other words, stories about Jesus were passed along word of mouth through countless people for 4 to 7 decades, changing along the way. And it's the forms these stories had come to after all those years of people that were included in the Gospels, far removed from the eyewitnesses. That's what Bart thinks. I come at this differently. The evidence for the traditional authorship of the Gospels is not perfect, but it's pretty good, better than what we have for plenty of other ancient literature whose authorship no one questions. Of course, it'd be great to hop into a time machine and ask ancient folks directly. We can't. So historians weigh the evidence, land on the most probable explanation, and hold their conclusions with an open hand, knowing they could be wrong. That's my approach to gospel authorship. With that in mind, let's dive into the data. We can sort the evidence into 2 buckets, external and internal. First, the external evidence. The early church agreed that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the Gospels in our New Testament. There are 10 or more early voices saying as much. There is, however, one exception. A report from the late 4th century said that some earlier people claimed the 4th Gospel was written by the heretic Cerinthus. Other than that one claim, the unanimous testimony of the early Christians is that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John authored the Gospels in the New Testament. So let's zoom in on the earliest witnesses, the 2nd century sources. There are 6. The first is Papias. He wrote in the early 2nd century. His original works are lost, but chunks survive, quoted or summarized in the writings of others, what we now call the fragments of Papias. In one fragment, Papias explains how he gathered his information. He writes, I will not hesitate to set down for you, along with my interpretations, everything I carefully learned from the elders and carefully remembered, guaranteeing their truth. And if by chance someone who had been a follower of the elders should come my way, I inquired about the words of the elders, what Andrew or Peter said, or Philip or Thomas or James or John or Matthew or any other of the Lord's disciples, and whatever Aristean and the elder John, the Lord's disciples, were saying. For I did not think that information from books would profit me as much as information from a living and abiding voice. Papias calls Jesus' disciples elders and says he personally interviewed their companions, asking what the elders said, past tense, and what Aristean and the elder John, the Lord's disciples, were saying, present tense. So Papias reports that he had interviewed people who knew the apostles firsthand at a time when at least two of Jesus' disciples were alive and active, including John. This means Papias received this information in the late 1st century. In another place, Papias says he learned the identity of the author of Mark's gospel. He writes, and the elder used to say this, Mark, having become Peter's translator, wrote down accurately everything he remembered of the things either said or done by Christ, though not in order, for he neither heard the Lord nor followed him, but afterward, as I said, followed Peter, who adapted his teachings as needed, but had no intention of giving an ordered account of the Lord's sayings. Consequently, Mark did nothing wrong in writing down some things as he remembered them, for he made it his one concern not to omit anything that he had heard or to make any false statement in them. In short, Mark served as Peter's translator and wrote down what he remembered Peter had taught. That's our earliest claim to the authorship of any gospel, and it comes from the early 2nd century. Next up is Justin. He wrote in the middle of the 2nd century and was martyred around the year 165. So it was commonly referred to as Justin Martyr. 15 times he refers to what he calls the Memoirs of the Apostles. On one of those occasions, he calls them the memoirs composed by the apostles, which are called Gospels. So the memoirs of the apostles are the Gospels. Justin shows knowledge of the 4 Gospels. 16 times he cites content found only in Matthew. On 4 of those occasions, he says it's the memoirs of the apostles, half of which are verbatim with our Greek Gospel of Matthew. For Mark, Justin refers to Peter's memoirs and says they include Jesus renaming Simon as Peter and the sons of Zebedee as the sons of thunder, a feature found only in the Gospel of Mark. This lines up neatly with Papias' report that Mark wrote what he remembered from Peter. On 2 occasions, Justin cites a passage found only in Luke's Gospel and says it's in the memoirs composed by the apostles and those who followed them. Justin also shows knowledge of 3 texts that appear only in the Gospel of John and quotes them in what's clearly John's unique idiom. Then comes Irenaeus in the final quarter of the 2nd century. He recalls hearing Polycarp discuss his interactions with the Apostle John and with other disciples who had been with Jesus. Irenaeus had heard Polycarp recount their words. Irenaeus names all 4 Gospels, assigns them to the traditional authors, and even points to each Gospel's beginning. This leaves no doubt that he meant the ones in our New Testament. And what better person to learn about the authorship of John's Gospel than John's friend Polycarp? Word of mouth? Sure, but an excellent source and one not removed by 4 to 7 decades. Around the same time, Theophilus of Antioch quotes the first verse of John's Gospel and attributes it to John. At the end of the 2nd century, the Muratorian fragment identifies Luke and John as the authors of the 3rd and 4th Gospels. And Clement of Alexandria attributes all 4 Gospels to their traditional authors. Bottom line, the external case for traditional authorship is strong. 6 early sources, writing 15 to 100 years after the final Gospel, all agree, and they're spread across geographically diverse regions: Judea, Asia Minor, Gaul, Egypt, and Rome. Now let's turn to the internal evidence. Let's say you're at a dinner party with a friend who directs your attention across the room to a real estate agent. Later on, you meet the guy. He doesn't tell you he's a real estate agent, but he mentions terms such as neighborhood amenities, lot premium, and builder incentives. Although that wouldn't prove he's a real estate agent, it would support your friend's claim that he is. So for internal evidence, we're looking for clues in the Gospels that are consistent with the external claims of authorship. Let's start with Mark. We observe that the early church said Mark wrote down what he remembered of Peter's preaching. So it's interesting to observe elements in Mark that are consistent with this claim. For example, Peter's at center stage in Mark. When Jesus speaks with disciples who are named in Mark, one figure dominates. Out of 21 such moments, Peter's in 19. And in roughly half of those, he's the only disciple in view. The only other disciple who gets a solo moment with Jesus in John, and he gets just one. That sounds like Peter's voice behind Mark's pen. Peter's personality pops in Mark more than any other disciple. He's outspoken, bold, courageous, proactive, opinionated. He charges ahead, stumbles and falls, and cares deeply about Jesus. It's the good, the bad, and the ugly of Peter, all of which are consistent with an author who knew Peter well. There are Aramaic echoes in Mark. 6 times in Mark, Jesus' words appear in Aramaic, followed by a translation. There's only one in Matthew, and that's where he's using Mark. There's one in John and none in Luke. Preserving Jesus' Aramaic sayings points to someone who heard them firsthand. The simplest explanation for these qualities in Mark is this is what it looks like when Peter is Mark's main source. He's everywhere, like the guy who always photobombs the group picture. Let's turn to Luke. Imagine I'm writing a biography of my mentor, Gary Habermas. I cover his birth, childhood, his schooling. I didn't know him back then, so I write, Gary did this, he went there. But when I get to later years, I might say, we co-authored a book together, and we attended several conferences together. Readers naturally infer, where I say we, I was there. Almost all New Testament scholars agree the same author wrote the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. And in Acts, the author pulls the same move I did with Gary. 4 times in the second half, the journey narratives of Paul flip from they to we. In other words, the narrator isn't just reporting about Paul, he's boarding the ship with him. Now, after much deliberation in the ivory tower, New Testament scholars have landed on a very sophisticated term for these narratives. The we narratives. Try to keep up. Notably, the we passages are among the most detailed scenes in Acts, which fits eyewitness reporting. And the geography checks out too, exactly what you'd expect from someone who actually made the trip. Craig Keener, a leading scholar on Acts, sums up the mainstream view of scholars. A large number, probably the majority of English-speaking commentators, believe that the author was a companion of Paul, as the we narratives suggest. So who was this person? The book of Acts and several of Paul's letters list roughly a dozen or more co-workers who traveled with Paul. Luke shows up in 3 of those letters. Since the external evidence is unanimous that Luke wrote that gospel, the most reasonable conclusion is the traditional authorship of Luke's gospel is correct. Now to John. John reads like it's based on the testimony of someone who was there. Exact times, many incidental details, and explicit claims of eyewitness testimony. The narrator sounds like a Jewish insider with front row access to Jesus and the 12 disciples. John chapter 21 links the stories in John to the beloved disciple as the eyewitness source and probably the author. That chapter even gives a short roster of 7 disciples who were present: Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others, the beloved disciple being one of the 7. So which one was he? His unique access fits Jesus' inner circle: Peter, James, and John. Peter's distinguished from the beloved disciple, so it wasn't him. James was martyred early, before the gospel was written. That leaves John, the son of Zebedee, as the best candidate, the same figure named by the external evidence. Bottom line, the earliest public memory and the text's fingerprints point most strongly to John, the son of Zebedee, as the author of the gospel that bears his name. Finally, Matthew. There are some clues in this gospel that suggest it was written by Matthew, who was a tax collector when Jesus called him. For example, there are more items related to taxes in Matthew than in any other gospel. Matthew mentions many more types of coins than the other gospels do. There's also a distinctly Jewish texture throughout Matthew's gospel. Matthew shows deep familiarity with Israel's scriptures, laws, customs, traditions, and Semitic turns of phrase. Now, there's an early tradition that says Matthew wrote something in Hebrew or Aramaic, perhaps a document with Jesus' teachings, perhaps an entire gospel, maybe even both. If he did, none of them have survived. Our Matthew was written in Greek, and it doesn't read like a translation. Did Matthew write our Gospel of Matthew? I think he's behind it. We already observed that by the time of Justin, his Greek gospel was already known and linked to an apostle. My take? Matthew oversaw a Greek gospel aimed at a broader audience than his earlier Hebrew or Aramaic work. He used Mark as a guide, since Mark was already in Greek. He made selective editorial tweaks to Mark and added a substantial amount of his own material, about 44% of the entire gospel. The Greek version took off. The earlier Semitic collection faded away and was eventually lost. It's a bit like Josephus. His original account of the Jewish war, composed in his original native language, Aramaic, did not survive, while the Greek version he supervised later is the one that did. Bottom line, I think Matthew was likely involved at some stage, perhaps every stage, but at minimum, contributed a substantial share of the tradition in that gospel. I'll wrap this up. Consider both buckets, the external testimony and the internal clues. Considered together, as best historical practice requires, they most plausibly indicate that Mark, Luke, and John wrote the Gospels that bear their names. Matthew is more nuanced, but the evidence points to his hand in shaping the Greek Gospel, likely with help in its final form. History doesn't promise certainty, but it does offer probabilities. And here, the probabilities favor the traditional view, and does so with better evidence than we have for the authorship of other ancient literature most scholars accept without a blink. The traditional authorship of the Gospels, not certainty, but the best explanation.
Okay, thank you, Mike, and thank you all for coming. I will start by saying I think Mike is getting probably the best case he can. It's a good argument that he's made. I used to agree with it. I don't anymore. And I'm going to tell you why. We'll have a chance for direct rebuttal later, but I just want to make the other side of the case. So, who wrote the Gospels? I want to start with our earliest records, which Mike said a few things about, and I want to say a few more things about. First thing I want to emphasize, this is not widely recognized, or people don't think about it much. I had several people before tonight tell me, no, I never thought about that much. Of course not. When you read the Gospels, it says Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So why would you think about who wrote them? It says Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John right there at the top, right? Right. The Gospels are published anonymously, as Mike said. The authors do not name themselves. Mark, the name Mark doesn't occur in Mark. Luke doesn't occur in Luke. John doesn't occur in John. Matthew does occur in Matthew, as I'll say something about in a minute. They were circulated anonymously. In the early years, they did not have names attached to them, as far as we can tell from our record. Are there any authorial hints? Mike says there were. I will be questioning him about some of those claims. For now, I'll just point out that the only one of these Gospels that says anything about the alleged author is Matthew. Matthew chapter 9, verse 9. I suggest you read it. Read it carefully and ask yourself, is this author talking about himself? Just do it. He doesn't. It's where Jesus sees Matthew, calls him to be his disciple. Matthew follows him. That's it. Not, I followed him, or some such thing. Okay, earliest quotations. Mike pointed out that we have second century evidence of people who attribute these things to apostles. Let's talk about that. Our earliest quotations are in the Apostolic Fathers, a group of writings from about the year 100 to about the year 140. There are passages in writings such as the Didache, where the Gospels are apparently quoted, but not by name. Our debate here is whether Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote these things, and our earliest quotations, whether it's the Didache, whether it's Papias, whether it's Polycarp, Ignatius, when they seem to be referring to our Gospels, they don't name them. And what we're interested in here is, when were they named? Who was the first to say that it is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? As Mike pointed out, Papias indicates that he has a Gospel of Mark that was Mark's account of the things that Peter said. It is really unfortunate that Papias does not quote this Gospel of his, because there's no way of knowing whether what he had is what we have and what was later called Mark. If he had quoted a passage or two, then we would know. We simply don't know. He also says of Matthew that Matthew wrote his gospel. He wrote the logia, the sayings of Jesus, in the Hebrew tongue, and everybody interpreted them or translated them as they could. As Mike just said, he does not appear to be talking about our Matthew. Mike didn't point out that it was precisely Papias who said that, because Mike wants to rely on Papias for Mark's authorship, but he says that Papias is wrong about Matthew's. Papias is clearly not talking about our Gospel of Matthew. It's not a collection of sayings of Jesus, and it was not written in Hebrew. So it's not evidence that our Matthew goes back to Matthew. And if he's wrong about Matthew, was he right about Mark? So it is right that, in fact, Justin Martyr does appear to quote at least 3 of the Gospels. He may be quoting John. It's a little bit harder to say. He does call them the Memoirs of the Apostles, and he does not name them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's an important point. Yes, he knows Memoirs of the Apostles. He does quote the Synoptics. He appears to quote other Gospels as well. He doesn't call them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He names only one of the memoirs of the Gospels, of the Apostles, Justin. Only one time does he name the memoirs, and he refers to the Gospel of Peter. It's not the Gospel of Mark. We have a Gospel of Peter, and it's the one that Justin names. Doesn't name Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. So, when do we start getting Matthew, Mark, Luke, John? Call it Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Our earliest attributions are about the year 185. Mike didn't talk about when he dates the Gospels. I'm not quite sure when he dates them. Normally, scholars date Mark to be the first Gospel around the year 70, Matthew and Luke around 80 to 85, John maybe 10 years later, 90 to 95. That's a general date that most people give, but we could argue about that. It's not going to matter much. Irenaeus is our first author to name Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we know, unlike in the case of Papias, we know in this case, he's talking about our Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because he starts quoting him. And so we know he's talking about our Gospels. Absolutely. By the year 185, we have a witness who says that they're written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That is 100 years after they had been circulating anonymously. What were they named earlier? Were they named earlier? The Muratorian fragment, written about the same time, Mike mentioned, does mention Luke and John. It almost certainly, I think, mentioned Matthew and Mark. There are debates about when it was written. Some scholars today are saying it was actually written in the 4th century, but I think it's probably about the time of Irenaeus. And so what we know is by the end of the 2nd century, people are calling them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's the external evidence. 100 years after they're in circulation, people start calling them that. Okay, so it's absolutely worth taking seriously. And that is what they're named. We also have gospel manuscripts that have the titles on them. And they're always Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. That should be taken into account. These titles, though, don't start appearing until the early 3rd century. After the point at which we know that they were called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We don't have manuscripts that have titles earlier than that. Once again, we're talking about a century after they were circulating anonymously. They're given names. But the names, when you read these manuscripts in Greek, the title of these Gospels is either for Matthew, is either the Gospel according to Matthew, or commonly, it's just according to Matthew. That's not a title. That's somebody telling you who they think wrote the book. You see what I mean? The author didn't call it that. I mean, I'm pretty sure they didn't call it title. I thought Mike's last book, did you call it according to Mike? Yeah, I think he was going to. I think he was going to. So, how can that be a title? Later I'll talk about why they're calling them these things, but I'll say they were unanimous after. These are unanimous attributions, and the question is, are they best guesses, false attributions, or are they right? That's the question. Everybody agrees they were called this at the end of the 2nd century. So how would we know? That's what I mainly want to talk about. How do we know? I want to talk about the most important consideration, in my view. Who were these authors? Just think about the disciples for a second, Matthew and John. The same thing I think can be said about Mark. It could be said about Luke if we had any idea who that was. The disciples of Jesus were Aramaic speaking, uneducated, day laborers from rural Galilee, according to the Gospels. Who wrote the Gospels? Greek speaking, highly educated, trained authors from Greek speaking realms. Okay, does that matter? I think it does. Is there a match between what we know about the disciples from the New Testament itself and what we know about authors in the ancient world? Could these people have written Gospels? So I want to begin with some demographics, and I just put a reference here in case you want to check me up, because I'm not making this up. Walter Scheidel is one of the major Roman historians of ancient economy, and Stephen Friesen has done a lot of work on ancient economy in ancient Rome. And what they tell us is that in the ancient Roman world, Roman Empire, 80 to 90% of the population was rural, living in rural areas. So 10, 15, 20% maybe was urban. The wealth distribution is that we have a pretty good sense of how wealth distribution worked within urban areas. Within the urban areas that are better documented, because that's where people who got educated and could write, so we know about urban areas. 55 to 60% of the urban population was living at or below subsistence level. Okay, so I'm just talking about the economic things here for a second. 10 to 20% were significantly below subsistence level, and in the rural areas, it was much worse. Most people living in rural areas, working in rural areas, were dirt poor. They were either starving or on the verge of starving, vast majority of them. So, what does that have to do with our question about who wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Well, who got educated in Greek? As Mike pointed out, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are written in Greek. And it's pretty good Greek. It's really good Greek in comparison with what most people in the ancient world could write, because the vast majority of people in the ancient world could not write. And those who could not write Greek. And those who could write Greek could not compose Greek. They could copy somebody else's work. Being able to write a long narrative, like the Gospel of Matthew, takes years of education. We know about this because we know a good deal about the educational systems in the ancient world. So, I'll give you another reference, Raffaele Priori, who is one of the world's experts on Greek and Roman education. This is a great book, Gymnastics of the Mind. You can check it out. And there are lots of other books. They all come to basically the same conclusions, which are that education came only to wealthy, urban, elite children. Those are the people who got education, who got trained. You had to be rich, come from a rich family, because most people, of course, they're living in the countryside. Most kids are put to work as soon as they can work, because you need them to help out. In urban areas, you do have wealthy people, and if you're among the very wealthy elite, then you can send your kids to school. If you send a kid to school and they're getting a Greek education, then it goes through several stages. First stage, you learn how to read the alphabet and how to copy the alphabet. And so it's a basic process of learning how to read. They did not teach reading and writing at the same time, like we do. Okay, this is all thoroughly documented. You can look it up. After kids learned how to read, then they would learn something about grammar, and they would start reading the classics. And so they'd read Homer, for example. And that's how they would learn to read better, is by having to read some of the classic texts. That's a second stage, and most wealthy elite kids did not get to the second stage. And most of the kids who got to the second stage did not get to the third stage. The vast majority of people getting educated in Greek educational systems did not get to the third stage, which is rhetoric and composition, where you actually learn how to compose writings. Like you can write a story, but even the composition isn't about writing stories. Usually it's about how to write a letter. How long did all of this take, this training? It took many years. Year after year, kids would be going to school to do this kind of thing, to learn how to do this. Very few people got it all the way through. Okay, so that's just generally. In the Roman world, the Greek and Roman world, in the ancient world. All right, what about rural Galilee? Do we have evidence of this kind of educational system in Galilee? No, no evidence at all. Do we have evidence of people being trained in a second language? If they were Aramaic speakers, as Jesus' disciples were, do we have evidence of those people going to school to learn Greek in Galilee? No. Do we have any evidence of adult education classes in antiquity? No. I had a question about this once, and so I wrote Raffaele, and I asked her about it. So there, did Peter later on in life go back to school and take, Greek as the language and learn composition? She said, no, there was nothing like that. Nothing like that. All right? But, what about literacy? How many people could read and write? Well, a common assumption is that people could read and write a lot, right? You got all these books right around, people could read, right? No problem. Again, the reference, William Harris, Ancient Literacy, 10 to 15% of the population in the ancient world, at the best of times, could read. And far fewer could write, and far fewer than that could compose. He gives tons of evidence. It's a really interesting book. Who were these people? Who were literate? Who could read? At the best, by the best of times, I mean Athens in the days of Plato. Okay, so we're talking like in urban areas. Who could read? Very wealthy, elite urbanites. What about in Israel? Didn't all Jewish boys go to synagogue and learn how to read and write? That's what I heard when I was young. But yeah, Jewish boys, they all learned, they had to go to synagogue school. We have zero evidence of synagogue schools from within 200 years of Jesus' death. There were no schools that we know of. There's no archaeological evidence, and in fact, there's no references to them until the 3rd century. If you're going to get educated, you got educated at home by your father. How widespread was literacy in Israel? Here's an important book. Catherine Hepner's book, Literacy in Roman Palestine. Oh my God, is that a thorough book? Common assumptions? Oh, every boy can read, right? If you can read, you can write, right? If you can write, you'd be able to write a story, right? Then you can write a gospel, no problem, right? Wrong. Only 3% or so of the population in Roman Palestine could even read. Those who could read would read Hebrew so that they could read the Torah in the synagogue. Far fewer than that could write, and if they learned how to write, they were trained as a scribe to copy the Torah. They were not trained in composition. The literate people who got to this position where they could read and write anything were the very wealthy, elite urbanites. We have only one author that we know about from the entire first Christian century who was a literary author in Israel, Josephus, whom Mike mentioned. We hear of one other Greek-trained author, Justus of Tiberias, but we don't have any of his writings. And then we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Were they wealthy, elite, urbanites? Acts chapter 4, verse 13 says that Peter and John were agrammatoi. That's the Greek word for unlettered. It's the word for people who don't know their alphabet. The book of Acts says that John was unlettered. My conclusion, Jesus' disciples simply would not have been able to compose these Greek narratives. People living in Israel, we don't know of anybody, any follower of Jesus who could possibly have done this. The Gospels are extensive Greek narratives. They're attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but why? They aren't attributed for over 100 years. Why did they come to be attributed later if nobody knew who wrote them earlier? It's because at the end of the 2nd century, when Irenaeus is writing, there are other Gospels in circulation. There's a Gospel of Thomas. There's a Gospel of James. There's a Gospel of Philip. There's a Gospel of Bartholomew. There are various Gospels floating around, and you've got these 4 Gospels that everybody in the churches, the main churches, are reading, but they don't have names, but all these heretics are using these other ones saying they're written by apostles. We need authority for these books. We better name them. They named them after authorities. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They needed the authority, and so they gave them the names, and they chose fairly natural names. They picked 2 of Jesus' disciples, Matthew and John, who could not read and write, I'm pretty sure, and companions of his 2 most important apostles. It's not an accident. You got 2 disciples on either side, Matthew and John, and then you've got the follower of Peter and the follower of Paul. So now you got the vision of the disciples and the vision of the 2 most important apostles, and those are what our Gospels are now called, starting around year 185. I do not think that they were originally written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Thank you.
All right, we are heading into first rebuttal period. Dr. Licona, you have 10 minutes when ready.
Well, thank you, Bart. In my opening statement, I argued that the traditional authorship of the Gospels is probably correct. I built that case using 2 buckets of evidence, external and internal. I'd like now to review my case in light of what Bart presented. First, the external evidence. I argued that the early church spoke with a single voice. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are responsible for the Gospels that bear their names. I focused on 6 2nd century sources, two of which were drawing on what they had learned from companions of the apostles. Now, Mark responded, number one, that the Gospels are anonymous. They don't contain the title in the very beginning, Gospel according to Matthew, according to Mark, etc. And he's right. I know some have argued, like Martin Hengel argued, that the titles were probably there with the originals, and some have as well. I agree with Bart on this, but this is a nothing burger, folks. And the reason being is because that was a standard practice in antiquity. There are about 90 extant biographies written about anyone that have survived, and they were written within 150 years on each side of Jesus. Would you like to know how many of them contain the author's name in the title? None of them. Not a single one. This was just the way they wrote in antiquity. So we may not know how they knew, but the ancients knew who wrote them. Now, he said, when you're talking about, you wouldn't say the gospel of something, I wouldn't write a book and call it according to Mike. No, of course not. This is the 21st century. The question is whether they would have done that in antiquity, and the answer is yes. I'm trying to think of his name right off. It's a prominent New Testament scholar, and in his Gospel of Matthew, he talks about, his commentary on Matthew, he says that Second Maccabees, it talks about the memoirs according to Nehemiah, using the same Greek preposition, kata. And of course, if you go to the book of Nehemiah, it's in the first person. So yes, they used that in antiquity in that sense. He says, well, no one directly ascribes the authorship of the Gospels to specific authors until Irenaeus in the final quarter of the 2nd century. Well, that's true, except for Mark. Now he says Papias was referring to Justin was referring to the Gospel of Peter. We'll get to that in a moment. Okay, but in terms of Matthew, Luke, and John, Bart is correct on that. The first person to name them specifically or attribute them to Matthew, Luke, and John is Irenaeus. So what I'd like to ask Bart is what he does with Tacitus' Annals of Rome. Because the first person who mentions content in them and directly attributes them to Tacitus is a Christian author writing 250 to 300 years later. Or what about Suetonius? The first person to meet the standard that Bart is saying here is Tertullian, writing 100 years later. Or how about Plutarch? The first is the Lamprias Catalog, written about 200 years later, is falsely attributed to Plutarch's son, and contains literature in it that Plutarch didn't write. There's one piece of literature that we know is written by Aristotle, and the Lamprias Catalog attributes it to Plutarch. What about Sallust? He wrote 3 pieces of literature. One of them, the first person to mention it, is Seneca the Elder, writing 75 years later. The other 2, Quintilian, 135 years later. And yet no classicist questions whether Sallust wrote those, Plutarch wrote those, Suetonius, or Tacitus. So I want to know if Bart thinks that counts against them as well, questions the authorship of those. Now, what about Justin Martyr mentioning the memoirs of Peter, and Bart says that that's the Gospel of Peter? No, because when he talks about the memoirs of Peter, he refers to content that's talking about Jesus changing the name from Simon to Peter, from James and John to the sons of thunder. Folks, that's content only found in the Gospel of Mark. It is not found in the Gospel of Peter. Okay, he says, well, they were just, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were just pseudonyms assigned to give them authority because they were competing with the other Gospels, Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Peter, etc., at the end of the 2nd century. Folks, that's just pure speculation, and it goes against all of our external evidence. I just want everybody to see here, at least I'm basing my case on evidence. Bart is basing his case on speculation. Now, he says, finally, he says that two other things. He says that Matthew, look at how he narrates his own conversion. It's strange. He just says, Jesus called Matthew. Well, I think that Matthew is speaking in the 3rd person here. And I know that might seem strange to us today, maybe like the old Seinfeld episode where Jimmy is speaking of himself in the third person and gets everybody Elaine and everybody George confused. The question is whether they would have done that in the first century and antiquity. And the answer is yes. Xenophon in his Anabasis speaks of himself almost exclusively in the third person. Julius Caesar, in his commentary on the Gallic War, in his commentary on the Civil War, from start to finish in both of them, speak of himself entirely in the third person. Jesus very often spoke of himself in the third person. The Son of Man doesn't have a place to lay his head. The Son of Man came to seek and to save that which is lost. Is it really so implausible that Jesus' disciples, Matthew and John, would have wanted to take after and emulate their Lord in this? Finally, Mark says that no way the traditional authors could have been involved because the followers of Jesus were uneducated, unlettered, they couldn't read or write, they were Aramaic speaking, whereas the writers of the Gospels were highly literate, sophisticated, Greek-speaking authors. Well, we don't know much about Mark and Luke, so it's really difficult to comment there, one way or the other. But when it comes to Matthew and John, I agree with them. It's a nothing burger again, folks. And the reason being is because they could have had help on this. In fact, I want you to think about this for a moment. About almost 200 years ago, slaves in the United States were becoming free, and soon after that, they would be freed. And a lot of people wanted to know what it was like to be a slave in the United States. Give us your memoirs. They begged for them. But of course, many slaves couldn't read or write. A really good example is someone called Sojourner Truth. She was a slave here in New York. I'm sorry, this is Boston, but she was a slave in New York, and she bought her own freedom. And people were begging her, tell us your story. Tell us what it was like to be a slave. Well, she couldn't read or write. So there was an abolitionist that said, we need to get this in writing. And so he listened to her tell the stories. He took notes, and then he took all of her stories and he arranged it all and wrote it down and acted as her ghost writer. And it was published in 1850 as The Narrative of Sojourner Truth. The author, Sojourner Truth. Now, folks, it doesn't take much imagination at all to see what probably happened here. Think about the disciples. They had walked with Jesus. They were teaching that Jesus was the Son of God. He offered salvation, forgiveness of sins, eternal life. People were believing them on this. And as the disciples were growing old and dying, how plausible do you think it is that people would have come to them and said, look, don't take this stuff to the grave. We need your stories in writing. Can't read or write here. Well, we'll help you. Plenty of people, yeah, literacy was low, but there's still plenty of people around that would have been glad to help them who were literate. And they would have said, look, I'd be honored to help you get this stuff in writing. And on top of that, there were plenty, I could list 11 people I know at minimum in the New Testament who had the means and would have gladly funded such a project. So I don't see any challenge to that at all that's going on. In fact, you've got the Muratorian fragment and Clement of Alexandria who says those things happen in relation to two gospels. So folks, I think both the external and internal evidence for the traditional authorship of the gospels still stands.
Mike and I, a couple years ago, did a 7-hour debate. And I think we should do it again tonight. So much to talk about. Okay, Mike says, look, it's common for books to be written anonymously, but we know who wrote them. Because this book is attributed to Tacitus hundreds of years later in Suetonius, and nobody doubts it. I would suggest that we look into the scholarship behind why we think Tacitus and Suetonius wrote these books, because it's not at all simply because they were named that later. One of the problems with a debate like this is to really explain the evidence, you've got to get down in the weeds. These other books, scholars study these things, and they always approach it with an element of doubt. How do you know Tacitus wrote this? It isn't simply accepted because somebody says so. You have evidence for it. And so the question is not whether it's just later attributed. The question is, what's the evidence for it being attributed? What's the evidence? And so that's basically what I want to talk about. When Mike says that writing a book calling it kata Matthew, according to Matthew, that was common, I would like him to give me one example from the ancient world where a book is titled with the person that it is according to. He gave us an example of a book which is attributed to somebody that doesn't have that person's name as a title. Where is the evidence of a title like that? I don't think it exists. The fact he points out you have external testimony. When does that external testimony begin? 100 years later. So tell us, why wasn't it attributed earlier? I'd like him to answer that. When he says that Papias is naming the Gospel of Mark, when he says the Gospel of Peter, because Boanerges is mentioned in both and it's not in the Gospel of Peter, I'd like him to tell us how he knows it's not in the Gospel of Peter. You may not know the significance of that question, but I'm assuming you might will. How do you know it is not in the Gospel of Peter? Right. We have a number of books from the ancient world that have external testimony that are right down the line for centuries. We have a group of letters, 6 letters allegedly written by Ignatius of Antioch, that everybody for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years said was written by Ignatius of Antioch, one of the Apostolic Fathers, and today nobody thinks they're written by Ignatius of Antioch. Why? Because later testimony is not evidence. Later testimony is what people thought later. He wants to stick with the gospel that Papias knows about the Gospel of Mark, and he ignores the fact that he himself says that Papias cannot be trusted. Let me make sure you understand what we're talking about when we're talking about Papias here. Papias is the first author we have, probably writing about the year 130, who says that Mark was kind of a copy of Peter, was taking down Peter's notes, and that Matthew was written in Hebrew. So he's writing 60 years later, and he's telling us this, okay? And Mike is saying he's reliable about Mark, but he's not reliable about Matthew. The reality is that Papias is not reliable about most things that he tells us, and I think Mike will agree. If not, we're going to have some interesting Q&A. For example, Papias says that Jesus taught that in the future kingdom of God, it's going to be such a paradise that every field will have 10,000 vines, grapevines, and every grapevine will have 10,000 boughs on it. Every bough will have 10,000 branches on it, and every branch will have 10,000 shoots on it, and every shoot will have 10,000 clusters of grapes on it, and every cluster will have 10,000 grapes in the cluster, and each grape will produce gallons of wine. Jesus said that? And he says that when somebody reaches for one cluster, another cluster will cry out, "No, take me, I want to be used by you." Jesus said that? Well, that's what Papias says. Sound like a trustworthy witness to you? Okay. When Mike says that Matthew and John had people to help them write, and he said, he emphasized that that he bases his views on evidence, and I base my views on speculation. Okay. Where do we find any reference to Matthew and John using secretaries to produce their writings for them, or to compose for them? Where do we find any evidence of that? Moreover, I would like to know what evidence we have from the ancient world that ever happened. It would happen today, where somebody can't read or write maybe, and they want to tell a story, so they dictate to somebody, and somebody puts it in his own writing. It'd be very common kind of thing to happen today, ghostwriting. I looked up every reference to secretaries in every Greek and Roman source in antiquity. to find out if people ever did that. I looked through every Greek and Latin author. They talk a lot about secretaries. They talk about a lot of people taking dictation. They never refer to that practice. There is no evidence of anyone ever writing a book that way in the ancient world, period. If Mike has evidence that there was, I'd like to hear it. Matthew and John were illiterate. John is explicitly said to be illiterate. Whoever wrote these Gospels had high-level Greek education. That is not true of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So, I don't think they wrote the Gospels.
Alrighty, we are going to transition into cross-examination at this time. We're going to rearrange the stage a bit for this segment. While we do that, I want you thinking about a question that you might have for the opponents up here, and that'll be at the last. Okay. Dr. Licona, you have 10 minutes to question Dr. Wainwright.
All right, thanks, Bart. So, all right. I want to know what you think about the we passages. Tell me about those.
The we passage. Did you read this? Oh, okay. Okay, good. The we passages, yeah. In the book of Acts, there are 4 passages where the author starts talking in first person plural. Where he talks about we. These come on suddenly and they end suddenly. He never says, then I joined Paul and we did so and so and so and so. It's just all of a sudden we have we. Scholars have long debated these. In my book on forgery and counter-forgery, I show that the use of first-person pronouns in narratives was often used by people who wanted you to think that they were the author. I will say that whether you agree with that or not, there are a million examples. I give a million examples where people will all of a sudden start saying we or I in order to, so you think that this is an eyewitness. Whether you think that or not doesn't much matter. The author, whoever says we, does not identify himself. All we would know is that he was a follower of Paul, according to the narrative. The argument Michael used that it was Luke is very, I'm sure, I mean, it's a common argument that it must have been a Gentile, that Luke was known to be a Gentile, that Luke was a Gentile companion of Paul. Luke was said in one book to be a physician, therefore he must have an education, and therefore he can write the gospel. That is the normal argument, and it's flawed at every point. If you want to know why, I'll tell you.
Okay, yeah, thanks. So, yeah, I read your book on that, and every single example you provided were either pseudepigraphy, but none of them were historiography. And as Craig Keener says in his commentary on Acts, he said he looked through and there wasn't a single example in historiography that he could find where an author did invent himself and put himself in the text as like we for that reason. So here's a question for you related to this. You don't like Matthew because he doesn't refer to himself in the first person. You say it's really strange. You also don't like Luke when he does refer to himself in the third person or the first person. So when they don't refer to themselves in the first person, it's suspicious to you. When they do refer to themselves in the first person, it's also suspicious to you. So my question to you would be, what would not be suspicious to you?
Like, I believe everything you say. I'm not suspicious at all. So. I actually like both Matthew and Luke. In fact, I really like Matthew and Luke. And I don't actually have a stake whether Matthew and Luke wrote Matthew and Luke. I have zero stake in this question. I'm just interested in knowing what happened. I don't have anything against Matthew for talking in the third person. I'm saying read Matthew 9:9 and ask yourself, is this the author talking? Just do it. Go home and read Matthew 9:9. Does this sound like an author talking about himself? Secondly, Luke does not name himself. Matthew talks about Matthew in the third person. Whoever wrote Luke 4 times in a different book he wrote refers to himself as we in connection with Paul. That's it.
Did you know that Plutarch never names himself within the 48 extant biographies?
Yes, I know.
You think he wrote those?
I haven't studied it. I don't know. I assume he did, but if he didn't, it wouldn't bother me. There are actually reasons for thinking he wrote them, by the way, because there are other references to it.
You mean external people who are saying that he wrote them?
Not 100 years later.
Huh?
I'm
Yeah, the first is 200 years later.
But
And then
I don't
after
know.
that, there's the
Okay.
Suda,
Okay,
which is
so,
like almost 1,000 years later.
so why are you assuming he wrote them?
I am not an expert on Plutarch there, but I can tell you that Christopher Pelling, who's the foremost authority in the world on Plutarch, says he doesn't know of a single classicist who doubts Plutarch
Okay.
wrote them.
Why not? What's their evidence?
So then there's Sallust as well.
No,
Same
no,
thing.
Mike, you're going to go through this whole list. I understand. My point is, we don't have evidence they wrote it. We're not talking about these
Well,
authors.
no, I'm not saying there's not evidence, Mark.
We
Wait,
find
this is my
evidence.
turn to ask questions, okay? So I'm not saying that I don't have evidence. I'm saying I don't know what that evidence is. But obviously the classicists do, unless you want to.
The classicists have evidence.
Right, and we have.
What's the evidence for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John?
Well, I gave it in my opening statement. I guess you weren't listening.
Well, in fact, what you said was the fact that they're attributed 100 years later doesn't matter because we have other authors who are attributed 100 years later, and I'm asking, how do you know those authors wrote the book?
Okay,
And because
but
some
we-
scholars said so, okay, fine, but why?
What I showed is that Papias knows of the Gospel of Mark, and Justin knows of all four. He may not call them by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He does attribute the one to Peter, in my opinion. And I mean, we could talk about that. I'd love to talk about that.
Oh, yeah, me too.
You want to?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, why do you think it's relying? All right, yeah, I got 4.5 minutes. Why do you think he's relying on the Gospel of Peter?
Because he calls it the memoir of Peter.
Yep.
And I don't know if you read the scholarship on this. Thornton wrote an article arguing that, in fact, he must be talking about Mark because of book narratives. What he's overlooking, there are two things he's overlooking. One is that the only verbatim agreements between Justin and any of the Passion narratives involve sentences that are found only in the Gospel of Peter, including the way that the unusual words for throwing lots. It's found only in the Gospel of Peter and in Justin when he's talking about the Gospel, when he calls the memoirs of Peter. And the reason we can't say that he must be talking about Mark because he has bow and arrows in both is for the reason you know. We have only a fragment of the Gospel of Peter. We don't have any portion of the Gospel of Peter from Jesus' ministry. We have no idea what was in that earlier part.
So
To
you're
say that
speculating
God-
it's in there, right?
No, I'm not speculating at all. I'm saying you can't say positive. Your argument is positive. You're saying it's not in the Gospel of Peter. And I'm saying, how do you know?
Okay, so I looked at the Greek of casting lots in Justin, as well as in the Gospel of Mark and in the Gospel of Peter. And I disagree with what Pilhofer and the others have said. I think it's closer to what you look at in the Gospel of Mark.
Mike, how can you say that?
Because I
Pilhofer
looked
lays
at
it
Greek.
out. The Greek is it's the same Greek words that are in Peter, but not in Mark. How can you say
The Greek that Justin is quoting there, by the way, the Greek that Justin is quoting there, it's, when you're talking about casting lots, it's not even in the same place where he's talking about the memoirs of Peter. It's in a totally different book. It's in the first apology, not the dialogue. So he's not even relating it to the memoirs.
It shows that he knows the Gospel of Peter.
No, the Greek is closer to Mark than it is Peter. There's more words there related to casting lots for Jesus' clothing, more words closer to the Gospel of Mark than the Gospel of Peter.
So all of you out there, read Pilhofer's article. Unfortunately, it's in German.
Yeah, well, and then maybe Bart can tell us all the scholars that have agreed with Pilhofer.
We are not, adding scholars up here.
Yeah, I
If
would
you're
say
adding
that
up-
too.
If you're adding up scholars here, then I think, that's not how we do our.
He can't name any.
Do you agree with Pilhofer?
Yeah, except you.
Well, I'll have to admit, I did not go through and memorize every author who talks
Just
about.
give us one.
I I don't have.
Okay, thanks. Let me go to my next question. Why would the Christians?
Why would authors agreeing with somebody make it true?
Well, I'm just saying, what I'm saying, okay, let's put it this way. Hillhofer he's not been able to persuade many scholars. And there's
Most
good
scholars are
reason
right on
for
this.
it. When you look at his arguments, they are wrong.
I completely disagree. But if you really, I mean, the only thing to do is to actually look at the evidence and not to count up the scholars who say this, that, or the other thing. Look at the evidence, and it's clear as day. These words do not occur in Mark. They just don't occur in Mark.
Okay, I've got 1 minute left, but I'll give up because it would take longer. No, I want to be nice. I'd be happy to.
I'm begging you.
Okay, let's do it then. So why would the Christians that were intent on boosting their authority in the Gospels pick two relatively minor figures like Mark and Luke, who were not eyewitnesses, instead of more obviously marketable names like Peter, James, Thomas, Mary, those who had walked with Jesus and knew him? As we do see in the later apocryphal Gospels, it's like your proposal that you gave, the reason they came up with these names at the end of the 2nd century is because they're competing with these other Gospels, and they have Gospel Peter, Gospel Thomas, Gospel Mary. These are all apostles, every one of them. Gospels written by, pseudepigraphal Gospels written by people who were either apostles or walked closely with Jesus. So if you're trying to compete with them, why are you making it the Gospel according to Mark and Luke? Since neither of them knew Jesus, neither of them followed Jesus.
We are on time. Would you like to answer?
I am going to answer the question, though, because it's a very important question. And people often say that Mark and Luke were minor figures. I don't know, we don't know who was a minor figure in the ancient.
I said relatively.
Relatively
minor.
for us, they're not well known. They're both mentioned by Paul. And the reason is the reason that Tertullian himself gives. It's that the Gospels are named after two disciples and the followers of the two most important apostles, Peter and Paul. Mark, the companion of Peter, Luke, the companion of Paul, so you get the entire apostolic witness. Two people who accompanied Jesus and two of the closest disciples to the major apostles. That's right. Tertullian says.
All right, Dr. Urban, you have 10 minutes to ask questions of Dr. Licona when ready. Okay.
So I'm
going to give you 30 extra seconds too.
I'm sure you'll have to stop me because okay, Mike. So the idea that you get the single attribution, like you get a single voice saying this person wrote it for an anonymous book. Now, the Epistle of Barnabas. Barnabas is people may not know it. Was a very important book in early Christianity. It's actually found in Codex Sinaiticus, one of the books of the New Testament, the Epistle of Barnabas. Scholars today are fairly unified. It was written around the year 135. To your knowledge, was it ever called anything but the Epistle of Barnabas? No. Okay, it's anonymous, but it's always been called the Epistle of Barnabas. How about 2 Clement? 2 Clement is listed as one of the books of the New Testament in Codex Alexandrinus around the 5th century, around 400 or so. It's by unanimous view, a book that was written about 100 years after Clement himself had died. Are you aware of it ever being called something other than 2 Clement? No. Right. These are books that were anonymous, that were circulated, that much later were called by an author, and yet they weren't written by that author. So I don't know what the evidence is that it's different for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John when they're first named by Irenaeus.
Because the Gospel of Barnabas and 2 Clement appeared Eusebius on his list of either doubtful or spurious, whereas the Gospels were never on any of the lists that were questioned by the early church, of which we're aware.
Eusebius is writing around the year 300. I'm talking about earlier years.
Yeah.
And ever since then, even Eusebius agrees that they're called Barnabas.
And you said they were included in what manuscript?
Barnabas is included in Codex Sinaiticus and 1st, 2nd.
And what year is that?
367.
Later than Eusebius?
Yeah.
Okay.
So they're still calling it that.
Yeah.
Eusebius calls it that. The manuscript calls it that. They call it that for hundreds of years. It was never called anything different. It's the same thing as Matthew.
That's right.
It's called something 100 years later, and then it just continues to be called that. But you agree that in these two cases, and I can give you an entire list of ones that are like this, you think, well, that doesn't mean that they were written by that person.
That's right.
But you do think that about Matthew.
Well, because they didn't have, all this external testimony that said
Yes, they do.
that it was written by Barnabas.
Yes, they
And
call it
Clement?
Barnabas. Yes, they talk about it being written by
Well,
Barnabas.
they're calling it that. They called it the Gospel of Peter too. I mean, that's the way.
That's right.
That's Bishop Serapion called it the Gospel of Peter, but he didn't believe it was written by Peter, right?
That's right, but they called it Peter.
But the same.
You're saying that Matthew must be written by Matthew because they called it Matthew all the time. They called it Peter all the time. They called the pseudo-Ignatian the entire time. They call Barnabas Barnabas. What they call it later does not determine who the author is.
Right, but when you do have all these different sources from all these different geographic regions and they're unanimous about it,
That's the same with Barnabas. They're unanimous about it.
and Barnabas is listed as spurious.
That's right. It wasn't written by Barnabas.
Right, and the Gospels, where are they listed as spurious? Can you give us
about
one
your
list,
evidence.
one catalog, one commentator that says that it wasn't written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John?
No, you can't give me any that names that Barnabas was not called. You're talking about titles now. Who did they think wrote them? You said that for hundreds of years until everybody said it's written by Matthew, and that's evidence for you. But when the same thing applies to other books that you don't think the author actually wrote, you say, no, that's not evidence because in the 4th century they recognized they weren't written by that person. And so it's not a good argument to say that they started getting named 100 years later and then they're continuing to be named that. Of course they were, though. What else are they going to call them? Okay, I've got lots of other questions. Oh God, okay. Do you know of any instance in the ancient world in which somebody had someone else write a narrative for them, that they dictated to them, or they told them the substance of what to put into it?
Not by a secretary, but if we go back with Clement of Rome and the Muratorian Fragment, well, that would be two that talk about for John and Mark.
I'm asking if we have evidence of anybody outside of this Christian evidence that you're citing, of anybody actually doing that, writing a book in someone else's name.
All right, so what you're asking for, you're saying bracketing the evidence that I have.
No, I'm
Let's
not
get out
asking
of
about
that.
the Christian evidence. I'm saying in the ancient world, do you ever have an instance of this happening?
Clement of Alexandria and Muratorian Fragment says yes with Mark and John. That's evidence.
Okay, I want evidence if this ever, you said this is naturally what would happen. So I want to know, when did it happen, apart from these things that are said 100 years later?
Okay, so
Give me one instance.
Mark and John. I mean, I think that this is, to me,
You're arguing about Mark and John. I want other evidence that it's common.
to me, for them to have done this seems so intuitively obvious
Right.
that this is what would have happened.
So did it seem
It's
obvious in the
virtually
ancient world?
certain.
Did it seem, it's virtually certain. So how often did it ever happen?
Well,
If it's so obvious.
How many people?
You said it was obvious.
How many people were the Son of God and had followers who were illiterate at the time? I mean, why would you don't have a guy named Simon who's a laborer in the field and he says, I got this dream of writing a memoir of what it's like to read weeds and maybe I'll get a secretary.
How about Apollonius and Tiana?
Well, he was a traveling,
Son of God, who had followers,
yeah,
and somebody wrote a book.
yeah,
And of
Philostratus,
course, Philostratus wrote the book.
about 100 and some years later.
Yeah, yes. And he didn't have somebody else write it for him.
That's right.
I'm asking, where is the evidence that this happened? You say it's obvious that it happened, you're certain it happened. I want to know, did it ever happen? Except for the two cases that you think it did happen.
That's right. Well, because there's testimony that it did. And what you're saying is
For those two cases.
but right. So you're saying, can you give me one? And I said, I'll give you two. And you say, well, forget can you give me any other than the two that you've mentioned?
Yeah.
I don't like them because
I'm
they're
trying to
Christian
find out-
and they
I'm
go
trying to
against
find
my
out-
view.
I'm trying to find out if it's right for those two. That's all I'm trying to do. know that you think those two were. Never mind, we'll go around all day on this one. So, how much time do we have? I'm sorry. Oh my God, there's plenty of time.
You can have 5.
Okay, so, all right. Where do you think Matthew got his education?
Oh, I don't think he was a highly educated person.
Okay. Tell me how do you imagine him? So you don't really think he wrote the gospel, you think somebody else wrote the gospel?
I think that they collaborated with it.
Okay, who was that other person?
I have no idea.
Who would he have been associated with?
Well, if I don't know who that other person is, I don't know who that
Did
other
Matthew
person
ever
associates
leave?
with.
Did Matthew ever leave Israel?
I have no idea after he's out preaching the gospel. Yeah, maybe.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about Matthew a bit more. You suggested that he might be a tax collector because he mentions money a lot. Is that right?
Yeah, for the internal evidence, that's consistent with it being written by a tax collector. Mentions taxes more than any other gospel author.
More than the other gospels.
Yeah.
So more likely he was a tax collector than the others were. Because tax collectors talk about money.
Well, I'm just saying he mentions taxes more than any others, and that is consistent with him being a tax collector.
The book of Revelation mentions money, mentions paying taxes to Rome, mentions gold far more than Matthew does. Revelation is about half the size of Matthew, but it mentions gold, for example, 5 times as often. Does that mean that Revelation was written by a tax collector?
No.
Exactly.
And so what's your point?
My point is that there's not evidence that Matthew wrote Matthew.
Why
Just
would
because
that
somebody
be?
mentions money a lot doesn't make them a tax collector.
No, it's consistent with it.
Does Paul mention tents very often?
No.
Exactly. Okay. Do you think that Papias is generally trustworthy?
Yes.
One passage in Papias says that Judas, after he betrayed Jesus, grew so large that he became enormous.
Yes.
He was so enormous that his head, he could not walk down a narrow street. His head would not even fit. He was so fat. Do you think that's historically accurate?
Have you read Stephen Carlson's OUP monograph from 2021?
Stephen Carlson was my PhD student. I directed his dissertation.
Did you read his
Yes.
monograph on Papias? Cool. Well, I agree with him. Do you?
No. Tell me what you tell me what you think about Judas's head being so big.
Okay.
He could go down the alley.
So as you know, being his supervisor for this is Dr. Fodder, Papias says that he thinks that Papias refers to the portion of his head being big. Oh, by the way, now he thinks that Papias may not have said any of that about Judas. But in his monograph, he says that he thinks Papias probably spoke in a hyperbolic kind of way there, jesting way. But the other part he thinks comes from Apollinaris of Laodicea at the end of the 4th century, because of the tradition where he talks about, and then he says, and they say, and then it's going to 4th century folklore.
He's talking about Apollinaris because we don't have the writings of Papias. We only have quotations.
All right, we are on time unless you want to take the extra 90 seconds.
I'll just make a comment for 20 seconds, which is that we don't actually have Papias' writings. We have quotations from later authors. And what Mike is saying is that this quotation, the later author, is not fully correctly representing Papias. So if he thinks that about this passage, why doesn't he think it about the ones that he wants to trust?
Because it's Eusebius, not Apollinaris of Laodicea, who's quoting the
Do you
others.
think Eusebius correctly quotes Papias? Do you remember what Eusebius said about Papias?
About the grapes? I have no problem with Jesus saying that.
No. About grapes talking? Okay.
Can he talk in parabolic?
I'm saying what Eusebius said.
Language?
Of course he could. He doesn't, but he could. He doesn't talk about grapes talking and begging to be picked instead of the others, the tens of trillions that are on the slide. But my point is what Eusebius says about Papias. He says Eusebius was a man of very small intelligence.
And why does he say that, though?
Because he doesn't like his views.
That's exactly right. He doesn't like his view of the millennium.
He's an idiot. Well,
That's why. I think it tells more about the pettiness of Eusebius there and the credibility.
And eat your source.
All right, gentlemen, we are over time. Thank you. We are heading into second rebuttal period. We're going to transition here just a moment. All right, second rebuttal period. Dr. Licona, you have 5 minutes.
This is so much fun. All right, so Mark talks about in his first rebuttal, he's talking about anonymous. The Gospels are anonymous, and he says what's important here is the evidence. I agree. You know, what is the evidence? And I did provide evidence for it. The external evidence and the internal evidence, which is consistent with the unanimous external evidence for the Gospels. He says, give me an example of a book with the title "According to." Well, I did with "According to Nehemiah." And he says, yeah, but you give it to me where you have that, we know it in the titles. Well, I don't know why he's even saying that, because he said they didn't have titles. And a lot of ancient biographies didn't have titles, and they didn't, none of them, as far as, like I said, within that 150 year on each side of Jesus, we got about 90, maybe a little more, extant biographies written by people. Plutarch wrote 48 of those, Suetonius 12 of those, and of those, none of them contains the author's name in there. In fact, if we look at just the proem, only one of them contained the author's name, and that's the Passing of Peregrinus by Lucian of Samosata, written in the middle of the 2nd century. And I'm not just cherry picking the years of 150 years on each side. If you want to expand that further, the next one is the life of Aelius in the Historia Augusta, written at the end of the 4th century. So, I mean, this was just the standard practice. I don't know why this should be a problem. He says, well, what about Ignatius? You know, some of those were believed at first to be written by Ignatius, and now some of those letters, nobody believes Ignatius wrote them. And he says, so later testimony is not evidence. Well, yeah, I agree with that, but I didn't base mine just on just later testimony in that sense. I'm looking at the whole thing. I'm looking at Papias in the beginning of the 2nd century. I disagree with him. Papias is writing in 135. I think it was earlier, maybe around 110. It's not a big deal anyway, whether it's 110 or 135. Eusebius does mention Papias in his Chronicon, which was written probably before his ecclesiastical history, and he places him in the same time that would be there around the 1st decade of the 2nd century. About Papias, he said, Mike said Papias was wrong about Matthew. No, I didn't. I never said he said anything about Matthew, except that he said Matthew wrote something in Hebrew or Aramaic about the sayings of Jesus. And I said I don't think he was referring to the Gospel of Matthew that we have. So I'm not saying that Papias was wrong there. I didn't mention him as evidence for the Gospel of Matthew because I don't think he was referring to our Gospel of Matthew. I do think that Justin has Matthew in mind because I said he is appealing to material content that is exclusive to Matthew 16 times. And in 4 of those occasions, he refers to it as the memoirs of the apostles. And in half of those, he's quoting verbatim from the Greek Gospel of Matthew as it would be in our Greek New Testaments. So let's see, and I answered that one. So yeah, I think I've answered all of the 6. So thank you.
Okay, thanks. Mike is an excellent debater, and you can tell he's he can be very persuasive. I'm not persuaded. Sorry. The external evidence is very important to Mike because he names a number of people in the 2nd century who claim that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Once somebody says that, everybody says it. That means they're not independent witnesses. Once the tradition starts, that's what everybody calls these. Just as they call the Epistle of Barnabas, Barnabas, Gospel of Peter, Peter, the very astute of Tertullian, they call it Tertullian. They name something once, and that's what everybody calls it. So these are not independent witnesses. They do not start with Papias. Papias mentions 2 of our Gospels. One is Matthew, and everything he says about it does not apply to our Matthew, as Mike admits. The other is Mark. He says a number of things about Mark being the secretary of Peter. That shows that by that time, we have witnesses, one witness, who thinks that the Gospel of Mark was written by Peter. We don't know if it's our Gospel. We don't know, because he doesn't say. He doesn't know our Matthew, as Mike admits. Does he know our Mark? The later evidence that Mike is appealing to, the first time Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is 100 years after they've been in circulation. The internal evidence that Mike cites, you should pay very careful attention to. He says, for example, that in the Gospel of Mark, Peter is center stage, therefore it's Peter's voice. The Gospel of John seems to have a lot of intimate detail, therefore it's by the beloved disciple John. One thing to point out about that is that if you have a narrative that gives detailed description about a particular person, that does not mean that the person is the author or that the person has given all of the information. If you don't believe me, read a good novel. I just finished reading David Copperfield for the 5th time, and there's a lot of detailed evidence about what David Copperfield said and did during his life, and he did not write the book. The fact that somebody's the main character is irrelevant. As to whether the beloved disciple was John, John chapter 21, which Mike noted, ends with a statement that says that, that this figure, the one Jesus loved, it says that he has testified, and we know that his testimony is true. Chapter 21, verse 25. He said it, we believe it. Does that make the beloved disciple the author? In fact, this author is differentiating himself from the beloved disciple. He said it, we believe it. If one of you says, tonight says, you know, Mike made this argument that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John actually wrote the Gospels, and we believe it. Does that mean that you are Mike? You're differentiating yourself from Mike. John 21:25 clearly differentiates the author from John. All right, I'm going to stop. We will take your questions. Thank you.
All righty, we have 2 segments left here, closing statements, and then we're going to get into Q&A. So again, if you have a question for the debaters, I encourage you to be thinking about that. We're going to start with closing statements. Dr. Licona, you have 5.
Well, pertaining to that verse at the end of John's Gospel, let me read the whole verse. This is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things and who has written these things. And we know that his testimony is true. It's third person. Throughout tonight's debate, I've argued that the traditional authorship of the 4 Gospels is probably correct based on 2 buckets of evidence, external and internal. In closing, I want to ask one simple question. When the early Christians said these books were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were they probably right or probably wrong? First, the external evidence. Within about 15 to 100 years after the last gospel, we hear from 6 early sources. They write from different regions. They write for different reasons. They sometimes disagree on other issues. Yet on this question of authorship, they are unanimous. Mark's reply that all these sources got it wrong. But notice what's missing: any competing ancient claims of authorship. If Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not the authors, who were? And why had they left no trace in the record? Surely the real attributions of at least one of them would have survived, since it's fairly likely the first readers of each gospel knew who wrote it. To overturn a unanimous, geographically diverse tradition, we need more than Bart's bald assertions and speculations. Asserting such and such happened without providing any supporting evidence is easy to do. It's much harder to explain the actual unanimous memory that spanned Judea, Asia Minor, Egypt, Rome, and Gaul with no surviving dissent. Second, the internal evidence. The traditional attributions make sense of what we find in the texts. A former tax collector named Matthew is exactly the sort of person who would care about taxes and money. However, a relatively minor figure like Mark is a strange choice if the church were inventing names for credibility. Why not go straight to Peter, as the apocryphal Gospels later did? Features like these don't prove the traditional authorship, but they certainly fit comfortably with it. So consider the two options before us this evening. On one side, we have early, geographically diverse, unanimous testimony, plus internal features that make the traditional attributions a natural fit. On the other side, we have hypothetical reconstructions that require us to believe that Christians from one end of the Mediterranean to the other somehow converged on the same 4 wrong names and did so without any ancient source ever saying, by the way, you got those books wrong. Historians rarely get certainty, and I'm not claiming certainty here. Room for reasonable doubt exists. What I am claiming is that if we approach the authorship of the Gospels the same way we approach the authorship of other ancient literature, they hold up quite well, often better than many of their peers that we accept without pause. Just treat early Christian testimony the way you treat other ancient testimony, not with blind trust, but also not by putting your finger on the scale to make it more difficult for the Gospels than needed. It's called the parity principle, which ensures fairness by treating similar cases in a similar way. It's a principle of consistency. If you do that, I think you'll find that the traditional authorship of the Gospels is the most reasonable conclusion. And this matters, for if the Gospels go back to the traditional authors, we are nearer to the events than many skeptics like Bart allow. We are listening to people in a position to know what Jesus said and did. Speaking for myself, before preparing for this debate, I was already convinced of the authorship of Mark and Luke. But for me, the jury was out for Matthew and John. I don't have to hold the traditional authorship of the Gospels where I teach at Houston Christian University, or to be a member of any of the academic societies to which I belong. So I felt no pressure to adopt the traditional authorship of Matthew and John. I ended up doing so because I believe that's where the evidence best fits. I surprised myself, to be honest with you. If you remain unconvinced, I hope at least that you can see that the traditional authorship of the Gospels is a respectable position. Thank you.
Mike and I actually agree on a number of things. I think the thing we agree on the most is that we hope that you consider the evidence. We also agree that we need to treat the Gospels the way we treat every other book from the ancient world. It is true that starting in 185, from that point on, everybody called the Gospels Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I'm not objecting to that point. It's absolutely true. It's true. What were they called before that? Why weren't they identified in the first 100 years? Why doesn't Justin ever name Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John? And if he's referring to the Gospel of Mark, why doesn't he call it Mark? The fact that you have universal testimony after somebody started naming them is not evidence for what they called them before that. It's somewhat deceptive to claim, as other scholars have done, that because these Gospels are identified everywhere at every time the same way, it's impossible to imagine how that could happen unless they go back to the same root at the time they were written. In other words, if you've got authors in Europe and in North Africa and in Israel and in Asia Minor all saying they're Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, doesn't that show that they actually must all be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Otherwise, how would everybody in all the different places come up with the same names? It's right, it all has to go back to the same root. The two earliest mentions of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John being written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are Irenaeus, who got his education in Rome, and the Muratorian fragment that was written in Rome, and they both give the testimony at the same time in the 180s, 30 years after Justin does not seem to know the names of the Gospels. Something happened in Rome where the Gospels were named, and it went from there like every other Christian belief, including, for example, the Nicene Creed. How does everybody say the same Nicene Creed? Because it started someplace hundreds of years later and spread everywhere. I actually want to close not by disputing this point and that point, because these debates are very confusing because we're talking about this detail, that detail, and what Pinky said this, and he said that, and Justin said this, and Peel offered German articles and things. I want to close on two other points. One is, I really do have nothing at stake in this argument. It may seem like I do because I get passionate about everything. I get passionate about whether there was a Q source. I really do. I don't know why. I don't care. But I get invested in things that I have researched. It would make no difference to my life if Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It would make zero difference to my life. My personal life, my professional life. I could actually write a book on it and become famous, proving that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If I wanted to improve my life, that's probably what I would do instead of all the hate mail I get. But I don't think so. I started out thinking so. I had arguments very similar to the ones Mike has mounted. I considered them persuasive. And then I looked at the evidence carefully and I decided otherwise. It was very difficult to change my mind about that and most other things I've changed my mind on. When you're listening to a debate or involved in a debate, there are two approaches that people take. Some people really have an open mind and want to consider the evidence, not whether somebody is more persuasive in their rhetorical, the way they deliver their rhetoric, not if somebody seems more likable than someone else, not if it's what they've always been heard. They actually just want to look at the evidence. What is the truth here? The views that I've been laying out, that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are not a weird view by a liberal professor at Chapel Hill. Okay, they are that. But they're not only that. They're not a weird view. These are views that I learned in graduate school attending a Christian theological seminary. These were the views of virtually all my professors there. They became the views of most of my friends there, who became pastors from there. These are not non-Christian views. These are views that are taught throughout this country at virtually every college and university that has critical approaches to the Bible, but also in seminaries and divinity schools. Why? Because the evidence is so strong. The other way to approach a debate like this is to try and find reasons to hold on to the belief you already have. If you go to a debate and you want one side to win, they're going to win. If you want to affirm what you already think because it's dangerous to start thinking something else, well, you will stick with your beliefs. If you spend years studying something and you come to the very same views you had when you started, and that happens time after time again, about every topic of relevance, that it's always the same answer that you came in with, but now you're convinced. Are you really looking at the evidence? Do you want to look at the evidence? I don't think Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John could write. If they couldn't write, they couldn't write the Gospels. Thank you.
All right. We are going to head into Q&A. So if you have some questions for the debaters, I have a couple of things for you. First off, you see there's 2 microphones. If you have a question for Dr. Ehrman, I want you to come to this particular microphone that I'm pointing at. If you have a question for Dr. Licona, I want you to come to this particular microphone. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I want you all to look at my face and how close the microphone is to my face. This is what I want you doing when you speak in the microphone. If the microphone doesn't catch you, we're not going to hear you. All right? The last thing is, please, we love that you're here, but keep your questions brief so that the debaters, we can hear from them and from, again, their unique insights and expertise. If you drone on and on, we love you, but I'm going to cut you off. All right, we good? All right, let's start with a question for Dr. Ehrman.
Good evening. Is this on? Okay. Thank you both so much for coming here. I really appreciate it. It's the first debate I've ever been to, so it was very entertaining. You said at the, Professor Ehrman, you said at the end of John, you referenced the, that they say we, right? Is it not possible that could be the scribe or scribes that could be assisting John in charting out, writing out the gospel that he knows but cannot write himself?
When it comes to history, nothing is impossible. The only question is, did that kind of thing ever happen, where somebody else wrote a narrative for somebody who was dictating it in a different language? And so if that did happen, then yes, that would be a possibility.
Let's go to Dr. Licona.
Yeah, thank you. Both can answer if you want, but in your book on the resurrection, you talk about a theory has to be the least ad hoc. So in your view, which would be the least ad hoc? That the titles go back to the original authors, as all the early attestation says, or that someone in Rome made up the titles, had enhanced power to make everyone agree around the known world. No one ever challenged this or offered alternative names, and no manuscripts ever had different names. So can you talk about which of those is more ad hoc in terms of historical criteria?
Good question, Michael. So I agree with Mark. I have to agree with Bart that I don't think the titles were in the originals because I think that was just common. Oh, okay. Well, I would. Then I think Bart's view is more ad hoc.
Doctor.
I wanted to ask about Tertius in Romans 16:22. If an educated man like Paul relied on a secretary, could you not argue that lesser educated persons would be even more likely to write through an assistant? What would you say, Dr. Ehrman?
It's an excellent question, because Tertius, it comes up all of a sudden, right? Paul's writing this letter, and all of a sudden, "Hi, Tertius, the writer of this letter, greet you." What? I thought Paul was writing this letter. We know a lot about secretaries in the ancient world because we have lots of references to them. And what they did is they took dictation. And that's what Tertius is doing. Tertius is writing down what Paul's dictating. So Romans is Paul's letter. Tertius is writing it down. That's precisely not what we're talking about with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In those cases, we're talking about somebody translating something into a different language and turning it into rhetorically effective prose. I looked everywhere for that, and it doesn't exist in the ancient world. So it's not like Tertius. Tertius is taking dictation. Mike's arguing that these people are actually composing narratives. We don't have any evidence of that ever happening.
But we do wonder how much liberty the putative authors gave to those who helped them compose those documents.
If there's no analogy to something ever happening, then it's unlikely it ever happening. If we don't have any evidence of that kind of thing ever happening, then why would you think it happened in this case, especially because no church father says that. No evidence mentions that, period.
Thank you.
Okay, Peyton and Peter, yeah.
All right, thanks for having us. Dr. Emmett, congrats on your retirement.
Thank you, yes, some people are very glad to see me go.
My question is, Mark, if Mark is being written by Mark, he's the right-hand man of Peter, he's his translator. How come the Christology of Mark is so low if Peter is indeed the right-hand man of Christ? And there's no mention in Mark of being born of a virgin. There's no mention of what happened after the resurrection. Even Mary thinks that he's out of his mind in the book of Mark, but there seems to be, he's not the Son of God in the book of Mark.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for asking that. Actually, I think Mark's Christology is every bit as high as John's. And I know that might sound crazy to you, but what you have to do is you go back and you look at what the objective was behind writing ancient biography. The most common text quoted of Plutarch is in his Life of Alexander, chapter 1. And he says, I'm paraphrasing him here now, okay? You're going to have to excuse me if I don't mention everything that a lot of big things that Alexander did, because I'm writing a life, a biography, not a history. And he said, just as the painters painted a portrait of someone, they focus on capturing the face and especially the eyes in order to capture the kind of person, the nature of this person. So will I now repeat the deeds and things that this person said to capture, to show you the essence of the character of who this person was. And so Plutarch's Lives they're trying to show you what kind of a person ethically and the character of this person is. And so when you come to Mark's gospel, oh, by the way, and there's other texts as well, Plutarch wasn't making that up. That wasn't just his objective. It was the objective behind others writing ancient biography. So when you come to the Gospel of Mark, how does it start off? As Isaiah the prophet said, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight his paths. What was it talking about? It's not talking about Jesus preparing the way for God there. It's Mark using that for John the Baptist preparing the way for Jesus, who is the Lord. Mark chapter 2, Jesus heals a paralytic and forgives his sins. The Jewish leaders say, well, that's blasphemy. Why? Only God can do that. Chapter 3, I think it's chapter 3, he stills the storm, which the Old Testament says only God does. Chapter 4, he expels a demon, and the Jewish leaders say, well, that's Satan casting out Satan, and then you've got Jesus saying, well, look, if you want to go and bind or rob a strong man, you have to bind him first, and then you can plunder his house of goods. And in doing that, he's saying by his exorcisms, he is actually binding Satan and now plundered his kingdom of goods. Well, what human binds Satan? And then the next chapter, he's walking on water or raising the dead, something the Old Testament says God does. Chapter 6, he walks on water, something only God does. It just goes on and on throughout the Gospel of Mark, and you can see what Mark is doing. He is, through Jesus' words and deeds, he is revealing Jesus, who he is, his character. He is the uniquely divine Son of God. It's every bit as high as what you find in John's Gospel. It's just John is more explicit in the way he says it. Thanks for that question.
Question for Dr.
Dr. Ehrman, I wanted to ask you this question, and then I was listening to Misquoting Jesus, your podcast yesterday, and it said you were coming to Boston, so I thought I'd come down and ask you. Matthew and Luke, written 50 years after Jesus died, after he was crucified, and they have the birth narrative, those two. And I'm just wondering, how did all that word of mouth get through those first 30 years and then match up with the narratives that were being passed along to when Matthew and Luke were finally written? You know, it's hard to imagine that that started and continued to carry on. That birth narrative was more something that happened after he was crucified, and then they were looking back at what happened.
Yeah, well, I think the interesting thing is that Matthew and Luke are the only ones in the New Testament who mention a virgin birth. That's one thing. So there's no evidence that Paul knows about it, for example. When Paul talks about Jesus' birth, all he says in Galatians 4:4 is that he was born of a woman. Didn't say anything about a virgin. And you kind of wonder what he meant. It's supposed to be born some other way, I guess. But we don't have evidence it was known before Matthew and Luke. And the other interesting thing is they tell different stories. It's not the same story. They're actually different stories. And when they do overlap, they don't agree. So the usual thought is that it was a later development within Christianity. That wasn't the original. It wasn't around before that. I think there's good evidence that Mark doesn't believe in a virgin birth. Mary comes to take Jesus, and the brothers come to take Jesus out of the public eye because they think he's gone out of his mind. And so clearly she didn't think he was born of a virgin in Mark. So no, I don't think that it's an oral tradition that starts way back. I think it's something that rises later. Some people think it's because Matthew, has this thing about Jesus having to fulfill Scripture, and it fulfills Isaiah 7:14. Other people think it's because it's trying to show Jesus like another divine man in the world, born of the union of God and a mortal. But I don't think it was an early tradition.
Thank you both for such a great evening. This is spectacular. So, Dr. Licona, I have a question for you. It's actually a two-part, but I promise they're connected here. So, you used two buckets of evidence, external and internal, that the gospel authors are probably Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So, using that same internal and external evidence that's used to demonstrate this, doesn't that also mean that the Quran is written by Muhammad, or technically recited because he didn't write it himself? Others wrote it down. So question number one is, if the threshold for what constitutes good evidence is simply that the text suggests that it was written by Muhammad, that's the internal part, and generations after, some people believe that Muhammad dictated the Quran, that's the external part, doesn't that then prove that the Quran is God-inspired and 100% accurate, just as tradition suggests? In relation to the Gospels, you said it's intuitively obvious to believe this about the Gospels. And so question two is, in what way is this situation different than what was debated tonight? Doesn't this fall under the kind of parity principle that you brought in your closing argument?
Yeah, good question. So what I said was, I think it's intuitively obvious that something that would be so probable as to be virtually certain is that if these disciples, at least Matthew and John, again, I don't think we knew enough about Mark and Luke, but Matthew and John at least, I would agree with Bart. I think they wouldn't have had enough of the education to be able to do it themselves. But as these disciples were, and maybe none of them were educated enough, I'm fine with that, saying that. As they started to die off and grow old, I think it's intuitively obvious that people would have been saying, you've got to get this stuff down in writing. You can't take it to the grave with you. I mean, my Greek professor, Ron Sauer, who was F.F. Bruce's final doctoral student, he's exegeted the entire New Testament and half of the Old Testament, and he's got it in handwriting. And he's in his late 70s. Doc, you don't take this to the grave with you. Now, if it's his notes on exegeting the New Testament, imagine when you've got eyewitnesses who walked with Jesus, going to be begging you, get this in writing, before you go. That's what I was saying was intuitively obvious. Now, in terms of the Quran, yeah, you do have some external evidence, and you're right about what we have with who wrote the Quran. It would be the Sirat Rasulullah, which would be the first extant biography of Muhammad, and then you've got the Ahadith that would attribute that to Muhammad, and all of them are 200 plus years later. But I don't think anyone would question that Muhammad was involved in the Quran in that sense, right? I don't know about the internal evidence. I saw David Wood walk in a little while. There he is, right there. I mean, I would punt to him on that. He's going to know a lot more about this than me. But I don't think anyone questioned, no one I'm aware of questioned. Well, I take that back. Jay Smith questions whether Muhammad ever existed. He's got an interesting argument. But in terms of Muhammad writing the Quran or being responsible for it, I mean, not actually writing it, he dictated it, the tradition says, right? And they wrote it down. I mean, I would still attribute that as him being like the author of it. So, that's how I think the external and evidence would be there for him being behind, responsible for the Quran.
All right, thank you very much.
This question is obviously for Dr. Ehrman, since I'm on this side. Given the use of amanuensis by Cicero, using Hero, Pliny the Elder, Seneca the Younger, Marcus Aurelius, and more specifically Tacitus, mentioning tax collectors using them for their reports, why do you find the possibility of Matthew and John using amanuensis so improbable?
I looked at every reference that you referred to, every author, and I looked at what they actually said about these people. Tiro is the closest one to somebody who's being used in order to actually write in somebody else's name. On several occasions, Cicero asks the secretary of Tiro, I need to communicate with so-and-so, I don't have time, just write in the letter and say this. And Tiro did it a couple of times, according to Cicero himself. The others, we don't have evidence of somebody writing for somebody else, actually composing for somebody else. The difference with Tiro in this particular case is that we're talking about a very short form letter. Ancient Roman letters tend to be very short and formulaic, where the beginnings and the ends are basically the same, and you'd have a paragraph in the middle to just give the content. And what's happening in these cases is that Tiro is providing the content that Cicero has told him. That is categorically different from writing a 28-chapter narrative that involves plot and characters and themes and emphases. It is absolutely not the same thing. So we don't have any evidence of what Mike is suggesting is intuitively obvious.
That doesn't answer the question with regard to Tacitus talking about publicans specifically using them in running narratives that are being sent to Rome. Different language, different everything.
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with the text you're talking with.
I'll have to find the passage.
Please send it to me, but yes, I'd be happy to see it. I don't think that there, in Tacitus, there's any evidence of somebody composing prose narratives.
Hello, Dr. Lacano. My question at the end of your statement, on your conclusion, you said we were listening to some people who actually saw it. We're closer to the events than Mark would like to admit. Something along those lines, at least. And what I'm interested in is there are parts of the text where people are not there. So, for example, in Mark, Jesus gets captured, and then Peter and all the disciples flee, and Peter, of course, denies Jesus, and then right after that, he's talking to Pilate. They're not there for that. And so there's some sort of verbal tradition that's happening in that between time. So my question is, why is it more compelling when we know there has to be some type of verbal tradition over having to have these books written by these eyewitnesses?
I'm not sure I follow you, because before they were written down, all of it was verbal tradition, right? So, if Mark is reporting what Peter said, I mean, that's what he had been teaching, as it was said, then that is verbal tradition there that Mark is now putting down in writing. So now Peter would not have been there when Jesus was before Pilate. Now we're just left to speculate. Was someone there? Was one of the servants there? Pilate later revealed that information? Don't know. We can only speculate. Did Jesus later reveal that to them? We can only speculate. Just don't know. You have to guess there. But it's all oral. until it gets put in writing.
Thank you.
Hello, Art. As one of your primary arguments tonight, you asserted the authors of the Gospels must have been able to read and write in Greek, expressly saying, quote, "That is not true of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John," end quote. Yet on your website, you currently declare, quote, "There are compelling reasons for thinking Matthew wrote in Greek as well," end quote, going on to provide evidence, including, quote, "Mark was certainly composed in Greek. Matthew therefore had to use a Greek version of Mark. He copied it in places in Greek. As a consequence, he must have been writing in Greek as well. There's no other plausible explanation for his verbatim alignments with Mark." So my question is, why should anyone believe your current claims when even you don't?
You're right, you shouldn't. But if you did choose to believe me, it'd be because I think maybe I wasn't clear what I was saying on the blog. Or in the blog. Was it on the blog? Yeah, it was on the blog. When I say that Matthew wrote in Greek, I don't mean Matthew the tax collector. I mean the author of the Gospel of Matthew wrote in Greek. Matthew the tax collector could not have written in Greek. So this book gospel, that's the evidence that this gospel was not written by that person. Sometimes we talk about Matthew as a person, sometimes as the gospel writer Matthew. And so I, like everyone else, I call the author of Matthew, but I don't mean Matthew the tax collector, who was an Aramaic-speaking peasant who had no education. So when I say that Matthew wrote in Greek, what I mean is the author copied Mark in Greek. So that author, Matthew, wrote in Greek. Does that make sense? You understand what I'm saying?
I understand what you're saying, but it doesn't hold true to your assertion, considering in the same thing, which I couldn't quote for the sake of time to try to be expedient. But you assert that it is indeed the Matthew that we traditionally ascribe to writing Matthew. Because you discuss about how it was the follower of Jesus, and you go on to provide other references as well.
No, I never do that. I never do that. You may want to reread it. I do not think that the follower of Jesus wrote the Gospel of Matthew. I call Matthew. There's no point in my calling it Fred. So I call it Matthew. And so when I say Matthew copied Mark, I'm not referring to the tax collector. I'm referring to the author of this book.
I appreciate that. Anyone can look it up on Did Matthew Write in Hebrew on your website. Thank you.
Yes, please do. In fact, all of you should join my blog. Do y'all know about my blog? It raises money for charity. People have to pay to join. I post 5 times a week, 1,200 words, 1,400 words a day. Been doing it for 13 years. People pay a small amount to join, and every penny goes to deal with problems of hunger and homelessness. I don't do that. We raised over $3.5 million doing this, so please think about joining.
It's a great blog. Mike, according to Papias, Mark strove diligently to include everything that Peter told him about Jesus. Why then do you think Mark left out that Peter's incident of walking on the water? Even though he talks about Jesus walking on the water, the same occasion, but he doesn't say anything about Peter doing it. He doesn't say anything about Peter cutting off the right ear of the slave to the high priest. Although Mark does talk about that incident and says that one of those standing nearby drew his sword. And why doesn't he include that Jesus gave Peter the keys to the kingdom? There's so many things that we learn from the other Gospels that happened to Peter that were big things. And here's Peter telling Mark, but they're not in this Gospel.
Well, Papias says that Mark was writing down, he made it his, like you said, he made it his objective to write down everything he remembered Peter saying. But as you know, you've got biographers and historians both are selective. And I think he's speaking hyperbolically there, of course. I mean, that seems to me it's simple hyperbolic language. And although it'd be nice if he had, mentioned those other things that Peter was in, he still mentioned other things that Peter was involved in. So, I mean, we could cherry pick and say, well, he's not in these things. And of course, the other gospels are written after Mark, I believe. And so they choose to include some of those things that Mark neglected to put in.
So this should be a real quick, easy answer. Okay, so it won't be terribly long. Based upon the criteria you gave today, as well as in other references, what would be your views on the reliability and integrity of the Quran and the Hadith?
Me?
Yes.
I have no idea.
You haven't looked into it?
You wanted it to be quick, yeah. Well, no, I'm not a scholar of Islam. My scholarship is in early Christianity. My scholarship ends, I go from basically Jesus up to Constantine, a little bit further into the 4th century, into the 4th century. And so I do not deal with Islam or the Quran.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. O'Connor, it seems to me that the shortest I can phrase the question is the synoptic problem. So it seems that in your internal evidence or your narrative of that it's intuitively obvious that as these people aged, they would recite or give their stories to other individuals in the community. It seems that the fact that we have the word-for-word agreement between the synoptic gospels makes that more difficult. It counts against that as internal evidence. Well, to me, it seems intuitively obvious that they would be kind of coming to those aged elders of the early church independently, getting those stories independently, and so the likelihood of getting word-for-word agreement across different stories, especially if at that time they had geographically dispersed, seems less likely. So I'd like to just, how does the synoptic problem fit into your internal evidence of how the authorship of these gospels happened?
Okay, yeah, thanks for asking that. So I don't see any real tension there. I see the synoptic problem. I think Mark wrote first. I think Matthew and Luke used Mark as the primary source. I think Mark probably holds to the two document hypothesis. That, in other words, he believes that there was a Q source, and I agree with that, although I wouldn't bet my life on it. My second choice would be Luke used Matthew as well, but I lean toward Q, okay, for various reasons. So I don't see a problem, like I said in my opening statement. When I think Matthew, I do think that he composed something in Aramaic, a saying source. I don't think that that's Q. I think that maybe Matthew may have had a part in framing Q, but I don't know. I think that he did write something about the sayings of Jesus in Aramaic. I think there's a good chance he wrote something, a gospel in Aramaic or Hebrew, and neither of them survived. So later on, he decides to write something in Greek. Mark has already written. Greek is not Matthew's main language, and he's got some people helping him. And so what ends up happening, they just, there's a little bit of a shortcut there. They're going to use Mark as the guide, and it's already translated in Greek. So why not use that? And then they lightly edit it, and then they add 44% more to it, and that's Matthew's gospel. Luke says there were many who had already written out there. So who were they written by? We don't know. But then he said he consulted the eyewitnesses and those who knew the eyewitnesses. And so he's getting different sources. Why not consult Mark, since Peter would have been behind that? Why not use Q? I mean, who knows? Q may have been from some kind of a saying source put together that had been collected. And so why not do that if they knew that it came from a reliable source? That would have been just another one of Luke's sources. So I don't see where that would be a problem with the synoptic problem.
Thank you. So we are running up on time here, so I'd say we have about one question each left. Sir.
Hi, Dr. Ehrman. I'm one of Mike's colleagues at Houston Christian University, where he teaches every semester fully online for our Masters in Apologetics. I do want to say he speaks as fondly about you behind closed doors as he does to your face, just in case you were wondering. We also do very much appreciate your book on Jesus mythicism, and I commend it to my students as well. It's very useful if it's it's out there, you guys should buy it. So my question is, we know that very early, at least from the time of Irenaeus, potentially also in Paul, there is this concern about pseudonymous writing, these false writings where we're trying to figure out what is genuine. We also know about the literacy rates, that this was very rare. The people that are disputing the pseudonymous writings would have known this even better than we do, right? Because they were there on the ground. When they're having these debates about authenticity and which gospel is trustworthy and which is not, the fact that these are written in the wrong language and are highly sophisticated documents doesn't seem to be a point of contention to say we've got to toss these out as well. That would seem to be fairly low-hanging fruit for disingenuity. So why does that not come up as a problem when they're trying to dispute what is the authentic Jesus tradition?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. And the reason is because these gospels are already accepted in the churches. And so there's not a dispute about whether these gospels are authoritative or not. They've been accepted as authoritative because they're the ones that people are reading and appreciating. People don't appreciate the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Peter or the various other gospels. These are the ones that have taken root in churches, not all at once. I mean, clearly, Mark had been in circulation for a while before Matthew and Luke used it. And most churches probably only had one gospel or another. Like Marcion, probably in the middle of the 4th century, had some form of Luke, for example. No evidence he had the other gospels. It's so hard for us to get our minds around this because, we're so used to, writing a book. I mean, if Mike writes a book, you get the same book throughout the country the same day. In the ancient world, man, it wasn't like that at all. We'd be copying things by hand. And so some books are being used in various places, but these 4 gospels are the earliest gospels we have. Luke does mention other gospels. Presumably there were others, but these are the 4 earliest, and they're the ones that were used most widely. And so people were not inclined to doubt these gospels. They were already seen as authoritative by the time there were discussions about authorship. And so there were no disputes about these gospels because these are the texts being used, even before they're named. And so it's a good question, but I think that's why. You wouldn't expect anybody to object. And Mike's right. We only have one piece of evidence of this from Augustine, somebody disputing it.
All right, final question.
Mike, thanks for your presentation. Barth's argument is that the traditional authors were not educated enough to compose the 4 canonical gospels. But whoever did compose these works must have sources of some type, whether an early less prose document like Q or Proto-Matthew, oral tradition, or even perhaps an eyewitness. Do you believe that his model's dependence upon sources takes the wind out of the sails of his model's explanatory power?
That's a good question. It's kind of loaded. I mean, that's a real good question, Kurt. I don't know the answer to that.
Kurt, I don't understand it. I got you till the end. Can you ask that last bit again?
Sure. So your model proposes that there are still sources, nevertheless, that the author used to compose the document, right? That's also Mike's model. Mike's model is that the disciples were the sources of the amanuensis, right? So in that respect, both of your models are similar. And so I think that takes out the need for from your explanatory power. It's just as good as Mike's. So in this sense, it's the same model.
No, I don't think so.
Now, all right, so if I'm understanding Bart correctly, he's saying that these stories were circulated about Jesus, and he's going to think a lot of them were just invented along the way, or they're very vaguely rooted in eyewitness testimony. Maybe they started off as something, they got amplified and changed along the way to the point where they're hardly recognizable. And it's those stories that someone collected and put together. Would you say that's correct?
Mike, I got to say, of all the people I know who are like really polemical, you do it so politely. That was a jab, man. Yeah, it was a jab. Yeah. Oh, Mark doesn't doesn't think anything's in it. There's been people making stuff up all the time. It's like, oh my God, what's wrong? So, okay.
Did I misrepresent you?
No, actually, that's what I think. So, okay, so I think I understand. So the issue is, Kirk, that it's not, the model's basically the same. My question is, what makes you think that it's Matthew behind it? What makes you think it's John behind? My point, we're not talking about in here, what we're talking about here is not about whether the gospel traditions are reliable or whether they're oral traditions. Or the question is, why Matthew? What makes you think Matthew? And if it's because people 100 years later said it was Matthew, that's not convincing.
Well, if you'd like, I could debate you tomorrow night on the subject.
Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for your debaters.
Hey folks, I'm Michael Licona. If you like this video, then please like and subscribe. And look, if you like content like this, then consider partnering with us. Go to our website, risenjesus.com/donate.